Hello, everyone. This is the second part of our study we began previously on Hebrews chapter 5, verses 1 through 10. Where we're going to be picking up is kind of in the middle of that as we look at how it is that Jesus was called to be the great high priest. The point where we left off last time was that to be a priest, it was a calling. It was something that you did not choose for yourself. It was something that people did not choose for you. It was something that God chose for you. And I shared how I myself got a calling into the ministry, and where we left off last time was sharing about how when I was in seminary, sitting around listening to people talk about why they were there. Most of them had a similar kind of story to my own, where, I was just doing this and God called me. But there were some of those guys there who said, well, I'm not really sure where I'm going, what I'm doing, but, I thought this might be a good thing. Well, I got to tell you, as far as I know, none of them really made it in ministry very long. So to fulfill the responsibility that God calls people to stand in the gap, really between people and Him. The one who's going to be able to bring His word to the congregation. It's a calling. It's not something that you would choose for yourself. I've heard more than one pastor say, I would never have chosen this for myself. This is more than I ever thought I could possibly do. So as we go through, where we left off was looking at chapter 5, and we were looking at the passages here in verses 4 through 6, where in verse 5, the preacher of Hebrews says, so Christ did not glorify himself so as to become a high priest, but he who said to him, you are my son, and today I have begotten you. Just as he also says in another passage, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. And so he quotes Psalm 2, verse 7, where God speaks to his son, you are my son, today I have begotten you. These are the same words God spoke at Jesus' baptism. And then after that, he quotes Psalm 110, verse 4, where God says his son will be a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. And we meet Melchizedek early in the Bible, in Genesis chapter 14, verses 17 through 24. The Jewish records of the priesthood are extensive, and they're thorough, and there is no record anywhere of a Melchizedek. But in Genesis 14:18, it tells us that he was the king of Salem and that he was a priest of the Most High God, of God Most High. So Melchizedek was appointed by God, not by any other person. He was a king and he was a servant. In Genesis 14, we find that Melchizedek is hosting and serving Abram. So the order of Melchizedek is a priesthood that, number one, is appointed by God alone. 2, is a servant priesthood. And 3, and this is key when we're talking about Jesus, it is one that will last forever. Finally, we come to verses 7 through 10. It's point 3 of what the preacher of the book of Hebrews is laying out. Point number 1, and when we started chapter 5, was that as a priest, he was appointed on behalf of the people to represent them before God. And Jesus says, no one comes to the Father but through me. Point 2 is that no one appoints themselves to be a priest. The appointment must come from God. And point three has to do with obedience. And point 3 takes us back to Gethsemane. The preacher speaks of how Jesus prayed with loud crying and tears that God heard him. In the days of his flesh, Hebrews 5:7, he offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one who is able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his piety. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation, being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. So in the days of his flesh he offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one who is able to save him from death. So yes, we're back in Gethsemane. The preacher speaks of how Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane after the Last Supper with loud crying and tears, and that God heard him. But simply because God hears, it does not mean that we get the answer we desire, even if we are Jesus. The Son of God cried out to the Father, "Let this cup pass," so that he would not have to endure all that the cross held for him. And yet, the Father said, "No, trust me, be obedient. Go to the cross, and I'm with you." So Jesus learned obedience, Hebrews tells us, from the things which he suffered. The Greeks never separated learning from suffering. We live in such a pain-free culture that often when we are suffering, we are embittered. We are embittered when suffering comes to us. We wonder, why is God doing this? I've got this little pain, and this bitterness keeps us from hearing God's voice through the pain. And we fail to see any redemption or value or learn anything. I met a fellow one time. Somebody said, "You need to go see him," and so I did. And so I understand that you don't like coming to church. No, I'm done with church. Well, why did somebody say something ugly to you? Why are you done with church? Well, he had lost his grandfather, and he had prayed that his grandfather wouldn't die. And when his grandfather did die, he became so bitter towards God that he just shut God and church and everything else off, even though it had been such an important part of his life before. And so, I told him I would continue to pray for him and hope that he would find healing. And when I left, I learned that his grandfather had been 91 years old. What do you do? I'm sorry you lost your grandfather, but what a blessing that you had him through, till he was 91. Most people don't get that. But he didn't see that. All he felt was the pain, and the pain caused him to be so bitter he could not hear God's voice through the pain. So yes, he failed to see any redemption, anything positive, or any value out of it at all. So because Jesus was fully obedient to the Father, even to the point of death on the cross, he completed his mission. What was it Jesus said? It is finished. And he entered into heaven perfect, without sin. And because of this, he alone is able to be the source of eternal salvation. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation, being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Because he stayed obedient to God, he entered into heaven perfect, the perfect sacrifice, the perfect lamb. And he alone then is the only source of eternal salvation. He alone is able to be the perfect high priest. He alone can stand with us before the throne of judgment and declare what it means to be human, to understand all that we go through, while at the same time being the Son of God, and offer us grace that only he can, so that we are covered by his perfect sacrifice and be forgiven, and our relationship with the Father restored. This is what Christ did for us on the cross, so that he is the perfect high priest and the perfect sacrifice. And only he, because he was perfectly human and perfectly God, can know our pain and offer us that grace. So thank you for watching the second half of this part that got interrupted last week. And we look forward to seeing you again as we get into verses 11 through 14 to finish up Hebrews chapter 5. It's an amazing adventure where the preacher tells us, look, we need to be ready. We need to be mature so that we can defeat everything that Satan is going to throw at us. So thank you for watching. God bless.